Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the SMPTE Media Technology Summit 2022. My name is Buck Moore, and due to circumstances beyond my control, I cannot deliver this presentation in person, so I am in Toronto at the moment. In the meantime, I'm thankful to be part of this event. Thank you very much for letting me present today. My presentation is titled Soundtrack Mapping and the D-Curve Presets. So it is a proposal for a standard to improve soundtracks in general, focusing on dynamic range and dialogue clarity. So, first of all, what's the story? The story is in part largely told by the human voice, which is known as the anchor element. Some movies have music as the anchor element, if they have no dialogue. But quite the majority of movies and TV shows have dialogue as the anchor element, and people do want to hear and understand the dialogue and not necessarily be blown out the back of the theater or have to gain ride their remote controls while watching a program. So the experience is the result of soundtrack design. I'm focusing again on level and intelligibility of dialogue and the overall dynamic range. So a bit of history on myself. I started playing with tape recorders at the age of 11. I started making movies at the age of 14. I never stopped both of those. I ended up going to college in 1985 for animated filmmaking. I took a year of that, and I continued to do multi-track recordings with my bands, and eventually became a professional at it in my 20s, doing live sound and then working on people's soundtracks. So I have had quite a history of wanting to fish out the vocals, which I got from one of these recorder manuals. It was a 4-track recorder. I believe it was by Fostex, the X15 or whatever the model is. It's in this picture. And there was a section on fishing out the vocals. And I thought, yes, I'm having a hard time fishing out the vocals. I never understood the concept until I read that little passage. But what it meant for me was in a song, in a soundtrack, in a live sound setting, people have to hear the voice. That's what they mostly relate to. My main software since 2003 has been Vegas Pro. Basically a hybrid application, if you will, where you can do everything in Vegas Pro, including the audio engineering aspect. So that has been my choice because I make my own films and videos. I work on other people's projects too. And I do everything through Vegas Pro because it has everything I need in the program to make things sound great. Also, I have been teaching soundtrack design and live sound engineering and basic audio for video since 2001 at Trebas Institute in Toronto. While I was mixing a show in 1998, a singer had belted out a loud vowel sound. I knew because I had this little CD beside me with in a player with all the critical frequencies that I would put my headphones on and listen to the closest frequency where the area was. And it turned out it was a lower middle frequency around 200 hertz, 250 hertz, somewhere around there. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not using any compression. I'm not using any, anything except for the strip EQ. And there was this offensive sound. And I thought, well, that's not good. I might need to do something. So I started to dip out the lower mids for vocals on a stage. And it became cleaner, and I didn't really need compression. I would just do gain writing after that. And since then, I started to put this EQ curve on just about every live mix I'd done. And I noticed that it really did clean up the vocal sound because I come from a vocal-based approach. I've mixed many live bands and live speakers, and I put this EQ on them. And it really cleaned it up. And I thought, well, I could just do this for pretty much every show. The key being some sort of high-pass filter and a lower mid scoop. Now, in a live situation, there's feedback control, so I take out between 1 and 2K for the most common feedback I've ever encountered. But really, it's about that low-mid scoop, and it was all about how loud the vowels were. And I started to think at the time, well, I'm doing this for the vocals. Now, I'm doing this on the whole front of house because the vocals are the most important element of a show, just like a soundtrack. And some people challenge me on this, saying, well, how could you put this EQ on the whole entire front of house? Well, that's because the vocals are the most important thing to me, so I'm going to EQ the vocals through the front of house and mix around the vocals. And so if a bass guitar needs a little more bass, I take care of it on the channel strip. Everybody has their own way of mixing. I understand that. But this EQ became my standard approach no matter where I went, with in-house ceiling systems, speakers on stands, line arrays, what have you. I put this EQ on and it seemed to work at every show. I started to add it to soundtracks, thinking, what if I put this on a soundtrack? So the first commercial documentary I worked on, aside from my own projects, the first paid thing, was a documentary about the salmon crisis in Kamchatka and the east part of Russia. And it was going to go on TV. It was going to go on BBC, CBC, Discovery Channel, etc. And I thought, well, I got to clean up the vocals on the soundtrack. So why don't I put the same EQ on the soundtrack and see what happens? And lo and behold, it cleaned it up and made it sound better and cut through more. So I didn't need as much dynamic range in the soundtrack since I was EQing the vocals this way. It just sounded much, much cleaner. So I realized that this could make the anchor element just cut through mixes. So that was my first experience putting this EQ curve on a soundtrack. This would assume professional microphones, though, that are flat between 100 hertz and 1K. And if a microphone had any preemphasis, like the AT815B, which I have, does have some preemphasis in the upper mids, well, you can tell by ear it's got preemphasis, and you leave it flat because it's already got it. But if it doesn't have preemphasis, you might want to add a little bit of preemphasis, especially if you're layering on sound effects and music onto a soundtrack. So I have two presets that I personally use all the time. And of course, the middle frequency can be adjusted depending on who's talking. So if it's somebody that talks really low, I'll just drag that lower mid number 2 control a little lower. And if it's somebody that speaks a little higher, I drag it up a little bit higher. But that's pretty much my preset. Both with a second order high pass filter, but one of them having no preemphasis on it because the microphone had preemphasis or it already sounded quite present, so I didn't need to add anything. But through subtractive EQ, I'm able to preserve headroom on the output because it brings the volume down just that 1 to 2 decibels sometimes, just by doing that low mid scoop. And I find, if needed, mild compression helps. So I generally put mild compression, meaning about 25% gain reduction, just to take the edge off the louder parts. I go as far as to use volume automation as well to just clean up all the details. So my process has been largely for dialogue because mostly I'm a dialogue editor. And I'm in love with the dialogue. I know nobody gets a standing ovation at the end of a movie for good dialogue editing. In fact, if you don't notice it, then you've done your job well. And the last couple of times I was in a theater to watch something I worked on, nobody questioned the dialogue. And I was like, oh, yes, okay. I'm alone at the back of the theater cheering myself on, going, oh, why are they asking questions about the story to the director at like a special screening or something? And nobody's mentioning how clear the dialogue was because nobody's really supposed to know. So that's my main goal through sound design, is to focus on the dialogue. So modest compression. Now, this is a sample of raw dialogue that I got, and it's a sample of Hollywood dialogue. I'll play it for you, but this was the raw dialogue when it was measured at minus 23.4 loudness units. So I put LKFS, it could easily be LUFS, but generally we're looking at about the same thing. We're looking at a final number at the end of this passage of dialogue, which is minus 23.4. When I put the D curve on it to scoop out the low mids, I managed to get rid of about 1.5 decibels. So now it's minus 24.9 loudness units. I was using Orban loudness meter. I still use it as a standalone loudness meter, but I also use Vegas's newer loudness meter built within the program. I compare them both, and I do all sorts of analysis on these. When I put the modest compression on, I ended up being at minus 26.4 loudness units, and I thought, okay, now I've lost 3 dB in total, from minus 23.4 to minus 26.4. And I thought, well, what if I just add those 3 dB back? Which is what I did. So I've got the D curve, the modest compression, and gain makeup now after the fact, and I found it cuts through mixes better, especially if you're going through like a screen in a cinema. But it also works for those HD TVs where people don't have sound bars or sound systems and the speakers in the TV point downwards. There's loss of clarity there, of course. So this helps with that too. It cleans it up.
I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. Warner Brothers, their efforts tolerated then but envied now. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. Warner Brothers, their efforts tolerated then but envied now. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. Warner Brothers, their efforts tolerated then but envied now. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. Warner Brothers, their efforts tolerated then but envied now. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. Warner Brothers, their efforts tolerated then but envied now. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. Warner Brothers, their efforts tolerated then but envied now. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value. I was greatly impressed with the device, but questioned its show value.
With the cinema sound mix map, compared to TV, of course, here, just for reference, I personally found that minus 27 plus or minus a couple of decibels for dialogue with the D curve involved. Because remember, the D curve, when you process it, it brings the dynamic range of the dialogue down a bit. And therefore, you can bring the dynamic range of the entire soundtrack down a bit. So aiming for a loudness unit of approximately minus 27, you might go minus 29 or minus 30, minus 23, and 24, the TV levels. Well, they might not give the mixer enough room for creative dynamics, right? So this is like a reasonable range for creative dynamics in the soundtrack, keeping the dialogue at minus 27 plus or minus a couple of decibels. This is before I found out that Netflix was suggesting the same thing on their webpage. I'll get to that, but this is like years before that. I just thought minus 27 seems to be like a good number to preserve some, creative dynamics, but not annoy people with soundtracks. So, dialogue is the reference level, of course, here. And Foley sound effects are generally under dialogue. A lot of them are transient in nature, like footsteps. So the peaks are going to rise above sometimes, and the ambient effects are lower. But that's all subjective. I mean, you don't even have to put ambience in a soundtrack and just tell people that's part of the creative sound design, and that's what it is. That's what the movie is. There's plenty of examples of films out there with little to no ambience in the background, and the audience just goes along with the story. But they can't go along with the story without the dialogue, and they get annoyed largely when there's loud sounds or loud parts of the soundtrack. So dialogue here is the focus of this map. Everything gets mixed around it. Loud, short peaks can be loud. I suggest -2 max. Less loud sound effects, but longer duration would come down a few dB. So these are not exact figures, of course, but I'm thinking within the 30 dB dynamic window for the timeline mix, because acoustically it's going to be louder. I found that jump scares, I've done many experiments on this and included a bunch of students and did some studies on this with the students to pick out the best punch length, which was about a half a second, meaning the loudest punch of the jump scare, or the loud portion, if you want to call it a hit point or a jump scare, only lasts a half a second, maybe 3/4, maybe up to a second, but definitely not longer than that. And that gives the immediate effect. But if you lower it 3 to 4 decibels while it's sustaining, it's much more acceptable to the audience. Also, adding a quick fade out of dialogue and music, will enhance that jump scare and make it seem more dynamic because you're getting rid of stuff. There's lots of examples in films. One notable example would be the movie White Noise. Not my favorite movie story-wise, but the soundtrack I thought was incredible, especially the couple of jump scares they used where they did this exact effect or this exact mix where they'd dip out the dialogue and music right before the jump scare, and it just makes it that much more effective. So I think that was a brilliant sound design. I did a cinema sound survey. I'm still gathering data. I don't have enough numbers, really. I do have a really good indication of what people are thinking. Quite notably, question number 2, have you had a hard time hearing dialogue in a film or TV show? Lots of people say yes. So I'm putting this into more concrete data, but in the meantime, this is my survey that I put out there. And some people felt the action scenes were too loud. A lot of people ride the remote control at home. And the last question I think is pretty important. Do you think there should be a standard level for film dialogue in cinemas and sensible limit on loud bursts of sound? Again, I'm still gathering data on this, and I've got lots of feedback from my videos that I posted online about designing soundtracks over the years. Many people think this. Yeah, I'm tired of riding the remote control. Okay, moving on a little bit. Netflix recommendation for near-field audio prerequisites. For mixed facilities, if you go to their webpage, average loudness must be minus 27 loudness units, plus or minus 2. Just as a gut feeling and through my experience and research, I always thought this should be the case. I found it on the next Netflix website. I was like, oh, well, there you go. Okay, so I'm not the only one thinking this. Okay, and audio should be measured over the full program according to the ITU-RBS 1770-1 guidelines. Let's take a look at that. From the ITU-RBS 1770-1 guidelines, that listeners desire the subjective loudness of audio programs to be uniform for different sources and program types. Netflix says they are committed to protecting the creative intent. We do not compress, limit, or modify audio mixes. However, content which is not excessively dynamic provides a better experience for our customers. So with the digital cinema, B chain, and low frequency effect, a 35 decibel dynamic range on the timeline can be up to 50 decibels, sometimes more, depending on who's measuring and how they're measuring, if it's A-weighted or C-weighted, fast response, slow response. But it can be up to 50 decibels sound pressure level dynamic range in a digital cinema. Let's take a close look at The Dark Knight. So I'm one of those nerds that sits there in the cinema with a sound pressure meter and a notepad, and I'm taking notes on the soundtrack. And to the annoyance of my friends or my wife, whoever, well, my wife understands. So I did this in Gravity. When we watched Gravity, I did the same thing. But I go to films, or I watch Netflix at home, or I watch whatever streaming services at home, and I'll take the same kind of notes. But I have a standard template which I go by, analyzing the different dialogue, music, sound effects, and background sound, which generally the background sound is way too low to even be concerned about, so I'm thinking about the dynamic range between the dialogue and loudest sound effects, and how music plays a role between the dialogue and loudest sound effects. And I found that The Dark Knight was about, on average, a 45 decibel dynamic range in the IMAX cinema, sometimes going up to 50 decibels or so. But again, you could see that the normal conversation dialogue, which pretty much equals how we speak day to day, around 60 decibels plus or minus. And then it ended up being 70 decibels C-weighted. Of course, 60 is A-weighted, and then C-weighted. So I wanted to include the bass and the no bass and compare them that way as well. And the loudest sound effects in the soundtrack ended up being 110 decibels C-weighted acoustically from where I was sitting. And I've known for quite a long time that the best seat in the house is about 2/3 of the way back. Well, that's arguable, I guess, but that's where I would sit because it's kind of in the middle of the seating area. And it's the proper point in the B chain where you get the best of everything. I guess that's subjective. Yes, I know. I mean, I did see the movie Inception in the front row to the left, bending my neck, looking up to the screen, going, this is a really good movie, but I can't bend my neck. So, yeah, halfway through the seating area and Coliseum-style seating, I'm making most measurements from that point.
One day, I saw a child playing with a ruby the size of a tangerine. The bandit had been throwing them away. With respect, Master Wayne, perhaps this is a man you don't fully understand either.
Here's the action scene from the same film.
Come on, I want you to do it. Come on, help me. Come on, help me. Help me.
So we had a digital cinema package for a student film festival where nobody mixing I think it was a few films put together, and nobody was mixing by the same standards. When we did a sound check at the cinema before the festival, it was unplayable. It was completely unplayable. And sometimes the filmmakers mix their own sound, which doesn't really work out because they don't have the audio engineering mindset. And not taking away from their films, the audio is really a specialty. So the audio engineering students get involved, but they're not always on the same page in regards to what the mix should be in the end. So you can see this digital cinema package. I'm using my volume automation tool, my volume envelope edit tool in Vegas Pro to bring up very quiet parts of dialogue and bring down very loud parts. Like the first part was somebody put a trailer. They had a film coming up and they said, well, I'm going to put a trailer here. And they made the horn blasts, those incredible contemporary, I don't know how big they are now, but a lot of films, trailers, have used the big horn blast to get people's attention, I guess. And they were just way too loud. So whoever was playing back in the cinema had to turn it down, and therefore they had the quiet parts of the dialogue, as you could see the quiet waveforms here, were way, way too quiet. So I had to go in. I said, just send me the DCP audio. I don't need the visuals. Send me the audio. I'll fix it up. And it was playable. It was back to about 90% of where it should have been. So there was a couple of scenes that might have been too quiet. So the popcorn noise, people self-regulated during that, and they could actually hear probably 90 to 95% of what was being said on screen, where before it wasn't the case. It was more like 50 to 60% of what people were saying on screen. And they didn't do any compression or anything like that in the vocals, so, it was all over the place as far as audio goes.
What seems to be bothering you? You're not yourself.
It's nothing. I'll be fine.
Better be. How's your essay coming along? Hey, Hannah. What seems to be bothering you? You're not yourself.
It's nothing. I'll be fine.
Better be. How's your essay coming along?
So the D curve settings in detail, about a 1.5 octave lower mid scoop between 200 and 600 hertz, all the way down to -5 dB. So it's a big little smiley face down there. It's a little smiley face down there. And I wouldn't go more than that. It starts to take out too much life of the dialogue. And a second order high pass filter, no matter how they record it on set, I'm going to put a second order high pass on there. On the dialogue, of course. And then about a 1/2 octave upper mid boost centered at around 7K, somewhere in there. So it's depending on your speakers, depending on your ears, and depending on the microphone used. That's a choice people can make, whether they need to add that kind of little icing on the top. Those are the details of the D curve setting. But in summary, the D curve can help dialogue cut through different types of mixes and in large rooms and cinema screens. So it's about cutting through. It's about fishing out the vocals. It's not necessarily about turning the dialogue up or down. It's about how the dialogue cuts through the mix. And mapping the soundtracks does result in audible dialogue and less dynamic range, which can be very annoying to the listener. And no volume writing or gain writing at home with a remote control, which we still do once in a while at home, especially late at night. I know there is the night mode on the television, but that really just takes the life out of the soundtrack. So I prefer not to put night mode or night listening mode on the TV because it just sounds unnatural. It's just way too compressed and weird. I feel this could be one step closer to achieving a better mix in general. If people are going by the same playbook, again, not taking away from creative mixes, right? You can still be creative, but we should have more of a level playing field. But it's not about us. It's really about the listener. It's about the people who pay to watch a movie, the people who pay to go to a cinema or pay for a subscription online for streaming films and TV shows. Well, TV shows are a little different, as mentioned, but especially the movies, which can be extremely dynamic. Really, it's about the listener. And it should start on the dubbing stage, or whoever's mixing it should start with a print master. And then you're delivering to a customer. It can't be 100% about the director's creative vision. It has to be about the audience members too. They have to be able to enjoy the playback, enjoy the project by, not having annoyances in the soundtrack. Like, I can't hear that quiet dialogue. What are they saying? Oh my God, those sound effects are way too loud. The music's way too loud, or whatever. And the decurve can be applied to an entire mix if it's not applied to the dialogue, or it can be a preset for a television. So I've done this on my TV. I go into the details of the audio and I put a rough decurve on there the best I can. And that's pretty much what my idea is.